Hello, church. Here we are in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, 21, and 22. And do you realize that today is another day in which you might face a foe, an enemy who would love to steal, kill, and destroy you? We are going to face big enemies today that are, in reality, if we were just to compare ourselves to them, they're far bigger and far stronger than we are. And yet the Bible would call us to not shrink from death. And it talks about people who did that. What's going on? In chapter 20, we have the story of David and his mighty men, and they faced some big guys. Some of their enemies had extra fingers and extra toes. These were big guys who had large weapons, intimidating enemies. That's an understatement. And yet what do these guys do? They have victory. Church, in Revelation chapter 12, it talks about the battle that Christians have against Satan and his army. That is a big enemy that we would never on our own be able to overcome. But it says in Revelation 12 how they overcame him, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. I want us to take that to heart, church, and realize that Jesus and his Holy Spirit and his legions of angels are so much bigger than any enemy that you are going to face today, that you can with confidence run into your day, run right into the fray of whatever is happening in your life today with an absolute confidence that with Jesus, you can. With my God, I can. Just like David said in Psalm 18. Church, run into the fray with God at your side. Recognize that we ought to not be those people who shrink from opposition and death, because we have the victory in Jesus. Maybe just start off a prayer and say, Jesus, help me today to not shrink from ... and then just fill in the rest of that prayer with whatever you anticipate is coming or might come today, because we have a confidence in Jesus. And then look at this in chapter 21. I want to point out a really sobering truth that I think we all know, but here's a great illustration of it. David sins, and it's not just because he took the census, but because we know that in Numbers chapter 1, God actually told Moses to take a census and so on. There's a time for that. But what David's doing here, and Joab picks up on it, is that there's something wrong in David's heart. Whatever it is, his motivation for doing it is completely out of line. And David himself in verse 8 admits that I have sinned greatly. And so what do we see? David is a leader of his people, and when he sins, the punishment that he gets to choose, if you look at verse 12, he gets to pick either 3 years of famine, 3 months of, just got to make sure I'm getting this right, 3 months of being swept away by your enemies, or 3 days of a plague, and that plague coming from the Lord. David picks the plague. But here's the thing, regardless of what he would have chosen, the people that follow David are going to be affected by his sin. They are not guilty because of David's sin. David alone will share his guilt, but his followers will be affected. You can even see that in verse 17 when he says, "What they've done nothing wrong, they are but sheep," and yet they will be affected by his sin. This is a great reminder that when we sin, the guilt remains with us and us alone, but the effects can spill over. Think of this: when a parent uses their money very, very foolishly and selfishly, are the children affected? Of course they are. Some children even go hungry for exactly that reason. And you can fill in the blank with that. Our sin affects other people. And every one of us leads someone. And so park there today with the Lord and say, Lord, who am I leading? Think about those people then that you're leading, and then make sure that you realize that if you choose poorly and fall into sin, you are affecting those people. Think about that with the Lord and ask him to help you and lead you in the right way. And then in chapter 22, I want you to see something really cool. David, if you look at verse 7 till about 16, David is talking to Solomon. David's getting pretty old. He knows he's passing on an inheritance and making what I would call a succession plan for his son Solomon. Look at what he charges him to do. He charges him in verse 11, build the house of the Lord. And then in verse 14, David says, I have taken great pains to provide for this temple that you need to build. And then he lists off this money, like thousands of pounds of gold. That's worth a lot. Never mind, probably more silver than you could really fit on a semi-truck, in addition to all the bronze and iron and yada, yada, yada. And then he says, and Solomon, you can even add to these things. Just incredible. He wants to build this magnificent house for the Lord, like it says in verse 5. But here's the thing. That's part of his succession plan. Do you know what David is actually saying to Solomon? And I know Solomon had inherited some other things, but when David is giving him these things, he is saying these things belong to the Lord, and you need to spend this huge amount of wealth on God's kingdom. That's a fascinating succession plan. And we could consider whether our succession plan, and whether we have kids or not, if you eventually one day will have kids, or someone, even if you don't have kids, and you're one day going to leave whatever you have to someone else in your will. What's your succession plan? Does your succession plan involve taking great pains to make sure that your kids or whoever gets your inheritance is going to actually focus on God's kingdom as the priority rather than receiving it all for themselves? Does your succession plan reflect that? And so maybe ask the Lord this question. Jesus, does my succession plan reflect value on your kingdom or on mine? Church, and let's be wary of passing on money and property to people who might not handle it the way we want. Are we passing on a legacy that says we value God's kingdom and taking great pains to make sure that that happens? Think about that with the Lord and look forward to conquering whatever foes lie before you today. Enjoy your day with Jesus.